As an authority in the field of cymatics, it would help our listeners to get an overview of what cymatics is and how it can help humanity. Can you give us a brief explanation on that?
I sure can. Cymatics is the science of visible sound. In other words, sound made visible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all know that if we can see something, we can understand it at a far better way, a far deeper level than we can with our other senses. And so the whole idea is, if you make sound visible, you can study it in ways that you couldn't study it with normal instrumentation. And so we have this instrument, we call it the Cymascope, C-Y-M-A scope.
Mm-hmm.
It can make sound visible. And using this instrument, it's opening so many different doors and so many different areas of science, because we can bring this new instrument to bear on everything from astrophysics through to biology, phonology, zoology, basically almost all the ologies.
Amazing.
And it opens up all sorts of new areas in science. It's a wonderful new way, a wonderful new gift, really, to science, to have cymatics as a science.
It really is a gift, to say the least. I've actually seen some of your work, and it's kind of perplexing and phenomenal at the same time, because when you see, like you were saying, you actually see basically the sound come into a form, which I think is something that everybody is kind of vaguely familiar with, maybe by ancient scriptures, but to see it in reality is kind of like, wow, what they were saying all along is true. There really is, sound can really produce physical objects in a sense. So it is truly phenomenal what you're saying.
It is a wow, and even seeing it on the screen, on a computer screen, it's not so much a wow as when you see it for real with your own eyes, right up close and personal. Then it's a real wow. And so even taking something as simple as a Chladni plate, a simple metal plate that you sprinkle sand on, and then you play the plate with a violin bow, even doing something as simple as that, when people see a pattern form before their very eyes, it's almost as though you're kind of like a musician, you roll up your sleeves, I've got nothing up my sleeves, and then you play the plate with the violin bow, and this beautiful pattern emerges, and you see the little sand grains or the salt grains or whatever particulate matter you've used, you see them dancing and kind of all gesticulating and trying to get into position, as if they're being controlled by, some force, which obviously they are, in this case, the power of sound. And this power of sound does have almost magical qualities. It can move matter, and it can bring matter into a form that is so beautiful to see. So yes, when you see it with your own eyes, that is something very special.
Amazing. So what about, what experiences and discoveries did you have while visiting the Great Pyramids in Egypt?
Well, it really was my visit to the pyramids in 1996 that began my whole journey of exploration in cymatics. I had been, my career was as an acoustics engineer, but I had never been to the pyramids before, and my father and I had been to Egypt, but this was the first time that we'd got to actually get inside the pyramids. And when we got inside the Great Pyramid, we were very fortunate that day, because we were able to be alone in the king's chamber, nice. And which is an amazing granite-lined chamber with fantastic acoustics. So you can almost hear the sound of your own blood rushing through your body, just because it is so quiet in there when you are alone. And so anyway, I was a little bit naughty that day. I lay in the sarcophagus. This is a 3.7-ton granite box that the pharaoh Khufu was supposedly interred in. I have my own ideas on that subject. We'll not go there today, but basically, I lay in the granite box. You're not supposed to do it, but I was a bit naughty, and I did. And I made a glissando sound, a kind of smooth, unstepped an undulation of sound. And at one particular frequency, I felt the whole of my body tingle from head to toe.
Wow.
It was kind of, it felt like I was being washed with a wave of energy. And I knew at that moment that this was something very special that had happened. It wasn't not the kind of thing that happens every day.
Right.
And it was that at that moment that I realized that, or at least I felt, that this was designed, that the Egyptians had somehow designed the acoustics of this chamber for a specific reason. And after we came out of the pyramid that day, I said to my daddy, you know, we really have to come back here one day and do some proper acoustics tests. And indeed we did that, or at least I did myself. Dad couldn't come that time, but I went myself. And I actually did two missions to the Great Pyramid. I did one in 1990, later in 1996, and then I did another one in 97. And it was the 97 tests, the experiments in 97, that really set me on the road to cymatics. This was, the reason was because I wanted to see what the resonances in that granite box looked like. You know, I wanted to look at them, observe them with my eyes rather than with other instrumentation. And so I searched around and I found this guy, Hans Jenny, the Swiss scientist who had done so much great work in the 1970s with visible sound. And so I was inspired by Hans Jenny's work, and what I did was I had a membrane, a PVC membrane manufactured that would fit exactly across the top of this sarcophagus, and I arranged 43 little bags of sand around all the way around the perimeter to give it a kind of even torsion. I had a speaker positioned in the bottom of the sarcophagus to excite the membrane acoustically. And then I simply sprinkled on sand and turned the system on and started looking at the patterns that were emerging in the sand. Well, the antiquities inspector was extremely bored. He obviously thought that I was a slightly crazy Englishman. I'd met him obviously the previous year, and I think he thought I was a little bit mad, but it didn't seem to matter to him because, you know, I had paid quite a bit of money to do these experiments. But now what happened was this, that at certain frequencies, what looked like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs started appearing on the surface of this membrane in the sand. And the antiquities inspector, who had been so bored, you know, sort of filing his nails, you know, leaning up against one of the walls of the king's chamber, he now comes rushing across to me, and he says, "How you do that? How you do that?" And I said, "I don't know. It's just happening. You know, these hieroglyphs were appearing in the sand, or what looked like hieroglyphs." And anyway, he was now very animated and saying, "How can I help you? What can I do?" And so I showed him what to do to scrape the sand off so we could sprinkle new sand on and go through a whole series of different frequencies to see what we could find. And we did find a lot more hieroglyphs. I mean, it was quite amazing to see these. The part of the story that I haven't told you so far mentioned is perhaps even more important in a way than the hieroglyphs. And it's this. 3 weeks before I was due to go out to the pyramids, this particular mission, I injured my lower back quite badly, and I was in a lot of pain. And in fact, so much pain that I didn't know whether I'd even be able to do these experiments. You know, I had 2 huge suitcases full of equipment. How was I going to carry these with this pain in my back? You know, I just couldn't even think about it. So other people actually did handle the luggage, the suitcases and so on. I virtually crawled on my hands and knees into the pyramid. I was in so much pain that day. But then somehow, you know, I obviously really wanted to do these experiments, and so you kind of blank the pain out and you just get on with it. And anyway, so started seeing these amazing hieroglyphs on the surface of the membrane, and about 20 minutes or so into the experiment, I suddenly noticed that there was no pain in my back at all. All the pain had gone. And in that moment, I thought, you know, kind of analyzing what was going on, I thought, this is endorphins. I'm obviously excited because I'm seeing these what looked like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was, I was clearly on a very, you know, great high. It was a high moment in my life. And I just reasoned that it must be endorphins blanking out the pain. But the truth of it was, Joe, that the pain never came back after, going out of the pyramid, going back to the hotel, eventually getting back on the airplane and so on. No pain in my back whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that something had happened that day. It was kind of semi-miraculous, you could say. Something had happened that caused that pain to go away. It was a severe injury that I had in my lower back. Normally when I'm a tall, slim guy, and I've had a lot of injuries in my back, over the years. But on this particular occasion, I knew from the severity of the pain that this was something that was going to take me several weeks to get over, if not, months.
Mm-hmm.
And yet here it was, within 20 minutes or so, it had gone completely. And that really set me on the journey. So two things. First of all, I knew that straight away that this Cymatics experiment, seeing the sound made visible within the sarcophagus there, that was an important moment for me, because I realized that it had the potential to be a new scientific instrument, a new type of scientific instrument. And then this other thing, the amazing healing of my lower back, that told me that something was going on with sound. I'd been making sound in the chamber that whole time. And I realized that it must be the sound that had caused this healing. And so that set me on another journey of exploration, and that was into sound healing. And how does sound heal the body, and how does it do it so quickly?
Now, really quickly, let me ask you a question, because I want to definitely go into sound healing. But what, before we get away from that subject, when you experienced the healing of your back, do you attribute that to a specific frequency, or did you ever figure out exactly what it was what frequency did you interact with to basically rectify the back problems? Did you ever come to that conclusion, or is it going to get to that?
I have come to a conclusion, which I'm happy to share with you either now or later in the talk. But yes, I've come to a conclusion. It's taken me nearly 20 years to reach it. Bearing in mind this was 1997, and here we are, 2016. And all those years, not continuously, of course, but throughout all those years, I've done a lot of experiments with sound healing, and so yes, I have come to some conclusions.
And what was the frequency or frequencies that was responsible for those healings, or do they vary from body part to body part?
Okay, well, if we're talking about it now, the first thing to say is that before the Cymatics experiment was set up, before we actually reached that point of turning on the oscillator and sprinkling the sand and all of that. Mm-hmm. Before that, I had done a pink noise test in the chamber, which is a standard acoustics test that is done to look at the acoustic profile of a given space. And this is a test where it's a sound rather like white noise, where the sound, say like the sound of the ocean, a rushing sound, or the sound of a waterfall. It's that kind of just basically noise, but it's noise which, from a technical point of view, means you've got all frequencies of sound present, and none with any more amplitude than any other. It's kind of, steady state noise. Mm-hmm. And pink noise is just a variety of that kind of noise, without going into too much technicality here. Anyway, I had done the pink noise test before setting up with the sarcophagus, and that type of noise, I do believe, at least in my hypothesis, my working hypothesis, is that type of noise was partly responsible for the healing. Mm-hmm. I've done lots of experiments since then, of course, over the years to look at what happens with sound in terms of biology. And there was one particular experiment. I'll tell you something. Before you talk about that experiment, over the years, I had come across a lot of people who were interested in sound healing, and they would always give me this kind of analogy of the human body as an orchestra that had gone out of tune.
Okay.
And what you're really doing with sound is you're kind of retuning the orchestra. You've got some player that's in the orchestra is not in key with the rest of the orchestra, and you can hear it as a discord, and that's a body part that's not working right or whatever.
Right.
And I'd always thought that this is way too simple. You know, this can't be the truth of the matter. That it must. I've always looked for the most difficult explanations for things. This seems to be my way. Anyway, so that was something that it was always in the back of my mind. This analogy, this metaphor, or whatever you want to call it, about the orchestra going out of tune. Well, anyway, a couple of years ago, I did an experiment which pretty much showed that that really is the case. And what it was, you may have heard of a scientist called Professor James Jimzeski. He works at UCLA, California, or at least he did. I'm not sure if he's still there, but he did a lot of wonderful work in nanotechnology. But this particular piece of work that he did was in a new field that he started called sonocytology. In other words, the sound of cells. And he uses an atomic force microscope to listen in to the sound of cells, and every cell has its own particular type of, song. You could call it a song, particular sonic signature. And he did a wonderful test with a yeast cell, for example, where he listened into the sound of the yeast cell, and then he put a little tiny drop of acid on the very near to the pharynges of this cell, not right on the cell, but very near to the cell. And the cell screamed. It could sense the acid. It knew it wasn't going to be good for it, and it screamed. And it literally made a high frequency sound, which was picked up by the atomic force microscope. Well, what I did was, when I came across these sounds online, anyone can go and listen to them. I put them into a conventional spectrum analyzer, an ordinary acoustic analyzer, to look at the frequencies that were present in the sound of the healthy yeast cell. So you could see the spectrum right away across the band, all the different frequencies, obviously not just one frequency, but lots of frequencies. And you can see them all dancing up and down, and this is the song of the yeast cell, let's say. And then I pressed a button on the analyzer that held all the highest peaks of that profile, if you like, of the yeast cell song. And then I put into the same analyzer the song of the yeast cell in its terrified state, with this drop of acid very near to it. And you see what happens is all those frequencies go way up the band. So they've suddenly changed the song in other words, the song of the cell has changed from its normal healthy song into this screaming kind of state, you could call it, where all the frequencies have shifted higher up the band. In other words, higher towards the high frequency end of the audio band. And so there you have it, the same cell, from a healthy cell to a terrified cell or a stressed cell, let's say, and the frequencies have changed. Now, through simple resonance, if you play the song of the healthy cell back to the terrified cell, what do you think would happen? Obviously through simple resonance, first of all, the cell knows what its song is. It knows what its healthy song is.
Right.
And so naturally it wants to absorb those frequencies. And what will happen is that the stressed cell will absorb the healthy frequencies and gradually bring the cell back into an in-tune situation. And that is exactly that's what happens. That doesn't mean that we understand the biology behind it all, but certainly, that is part of the hypothesis that I have developed. The other part of it concerns white noise or pink noise. If you have an illness in your body, what's essentially happening is that the cells in that system of your body are in a quiescent state. They're not in the normal replicating state. They're in what's called the G0 state, which basically means that they are kind of asleep. They're not dead. They're obviously not replicating in the normal way. They're in this kind of comatose state where they're kind of asleep. And so what's needed to bring them back into a normal, healthy state, the G1 state, where they are replicating and operating totally normally. If you look this up, you'll find that from a biological point of view, typically they talk about nutrition bringing the cell back to its normal healthy state if it's in a G0 state. But the other thing, part of the hypothesis is that sound itself is a kind of food to the cell, and it will absorb those sonic frequencies and help to trigger the cell back into a normal, healthy state. The other aspect to sound healing is that cells have memory, and cells will remember a given trauma. So if you have a system of the body that's in great trauma, there's a cellular memory of that trauma. Even when you become well again, the cells are still remembering to some extent the memory, of that event, that trauma, whatever it was, and can be triggered back into that illness again quite readily.
Right.
So one of the things that happens with white noise or pink noise, it kind of erases cellular memory. And so what I'm believing, Joe, is that the state that my lower back was in at the point when I reached the pyramid, perhaps because it had happened 3 weeks earlier, and perhaps most of the healing in my body had already taken place, really. However, the cells were still holding on to the memory of the pain, etc.
Right.
They weren't letting go of that memory. And what happened was, while I was doing the pink noise tests in the King's Chamber, that helped to erase that memory, that cellular memory. And then when I started using the low frequencies to actually, inject into the sarcophagus, perhaps some of those low frequencies were also helping to kind of ease the cell back into a normal G1 state. I don't know for sure. All I can say is the pain went away and it never came back.
Nice.
And all this work that I've done since, it seems to suggest that they are the primary mechanisms at work.
Now, when you were doing resonant tests, that you said you were doing some type of sound frequency test while in the actual pyramid itself that was producing hieroglyphs. What type of hieroglyphs were those tests producing?
Well, I eventually wrote an article on this and published in that article. There are lots of different hieroglyphs that came from that series of experiments. But you will see, for example, Ra, the sun god, which is the hieroglyph is a circle within a circle.
Right.
That was one of the hieroglyphs. Another one was the Jed pillar. This is the backbone of the god Osiris, and that's a kind of series of horizontal striations. And in this case, it wasn't just a static Jed pillar on the surface of the membrane. It was animated. It was very dynamic. It was kind of snaking, almost like a snake, on the surface of the membrane. That got the Antiquities Inspector very excited, as it did me, to see this animated snake-like thing on the surface of the membrane. There was also the SAW loop, which is a kind of what looks a bit like a knot. This is the sign for the hieroglyph for protection.
Okay.
Lots of other hieroglyphs. A lot of people have said, well, did it say anything? What does it say? It wasn't a case of that. It was simply a case that you had this whole series of hieroglyphs. And so I know a lot of people have said to me in various talks that I've given over the years, well, how did this happen? Did the ancient Egyptians have some kind of an amazing high technology that they'd embedded these hieroglyphs in the sarcophagus so that you would come along 5,000 years later and find them?
Right.
The answer is no. I don't subscribe to that kind of belief system. I always look for a rational kind of explanation, and in this case, I have a hypothesis as to how it could have come about, and it's really very simple. When you think about sound as having structure, all sounds create structure when they interact with a membrane, as we've just talked about. Well, if you think back to the days of the ancient Egyptians, and they're in the quarry, and they're literally hammering this sarcophagus into its form. You take a solid block of granite, you use a huge tubular drill initially to take out the bulk of the inner part of what's going to form the sarcophagus. But then you've got to hammer it a lot to get rid of all the little bumps and lumps. And they don't use chisels on granite in those days. They're using pounding balls to literally pound down the surface of the granite. Well, when you do that, what happens is granite is, certainly the type of granite they were using, Aswan granite, has about 25% of quartz crystal in it. It's a very high percentage of quartz. And so the granite has a great resonance. It's a wonderful resonant material. And when you strike it with a hammer, or in this case a pounding ball, it creates a beautiful low-pitched sound. And it's quite a complex sound. It's not a simple pure tone. It's a complex sound. Well, you can imagine if there was a membrane anywhere in the vicinity of of that work going on, it would exhibit patterns if there was sound as well. So one possibility, and there's only one of several that I've been thinking about, but one is that there in the quarry was a drum head, because maybe the workers have have their little musical interludes in their work. I don't know, but possibly there was a drum head nearby with sand sprinkled on it, which would probably be as the result of just the fact that they're in a sandy environment.
Right.
And when these sounds were occurring, there would be patterns. If there was a drum head, there would be patterns forming on it. And perhaps the scribe who was there to measure the work that the men were doing, perhaps that scribe looked at the pattern and said, "Whoa, that's interesting," and he made a note of it. Now, this might sound totally crazy, but one of the facts that pops out of this, if you look into the history of when did the Egyptians first start working their hard stones such as granite, it turns out it's around about 3,900 BCE in a place called Hierakonpolis, or ancient Nekhen. And for the same date in history and the same place in history, 3,900 Hierakonpolis, or ancient Nekhen, is when the Egyptians were first developing their hieroglyphic language. So there is a definite correlation there between the working of hard stones and the Egyptian language. And so this, what I postulated about the drumhead may not be so crazy. It may be that. But there are other explanations that I could go into if we had more time, and we could do that another time. But certainly there's definitely a connection there. And so I believe there's a very rational explanation as to why the sarcophagus produces these what look like hieroglyphs. Because let's say that the scribes saw these patterns on the drumhead and thought, they're interesting forms. We could use that. Perhaps they thought it was magical, and it is a kind of magic, isn't it?
Right.
We can use that in our, developing our hieroglyphic language. So they write these forms down. They ultimately get embedded in the hieroglyphic language, and then 5,000 years later, I excite the sarcophagus in a different way, a high-tech way, but I'm still exciting it acoustically, and see the very same patterns.
Right.
So there's a reasonable explanation.
Sure.
It may not be the right one.
Do you think that sound vibration was responsible for the construction of the pyramids?
No, I honestly don't. I've been to Egypt. I must have been at least 20 times now, and I do have an interest. I have a great interest, actually, in the ancient Egyptians' working of stones, particularly the hard stones, because there's a big mystery around how they worked their hard stones. In the Old Kingdom, according to the standard Egyptological model, all they had was copper as a metal. They didn't even have bronze in the Old Kingdom, according to the standard model. But if you bring copper tools to bear against granite, you'll get absolutely no results, excepting if you use a tubular drill.
Right.
But in terms of shaping granite, you won't be able to shape it. I've mentioned the pounding balls. Yeah, that's fine for shaping something as crude as a sarcophagus. But what about these really hard stone statues, like the statue of Khafra, for example. This amazing piece of sculpture. You know, it even today it would be a major challenge for any sculptor, even using tungsten carbide tipped chisels and things. Major problem. If you look at that statue or any of the statues from that era, the Old Kingdom, they're so beautifully detailed, and so how could you do that without iron? It's
right.
like.
So you think they use iron to do their construction and shaping?
Yeah, how can you do that with copper tools? You see, and that's the standard model. So I've always been interested in this puzzle. Anyway, so having been to Egypt about 20 times and studied the pyramids, standing outside the pyramids, looking up at the stones and all the course lines and so on, you get a kind of feel, from an engineering perspective. My dad has also got a feel for the people that built these pyramids, and obviously we studied them for a long time, looking at how they might have built them. But if you go to the third pyramid, Menkaure pyramid, there's a ramp still existing. That theory of how they drag stones up ramps. There's part of a ramp still there, so it's more than a theory, isn't it, that they used ramps, but it still doesn't solve all the problems. And I saw a wonderful documentary recently that showed put together the hypothesis that they built the pyramids from the inside out. That really is thinking outside the box, and it seemed very logical. There has to be a reason, a way to get those stones to the very top of the pyramid. And I have heard the story, or not the story, but the hypothesis that the Egyptians used sound to build pyramids. I don't think that way, because nothing that I ever saw in Egypt suggested to me that the ancient Egyptians had any high technology. They certainly had technologies, that's for absolute certain, and they did things in a way that we wouldn't do today. They had methods and so on that we just wouldn't adopt, because we don't need to. We don't need to do things the way they did. They had their own methods and their own technologies. But nevertheless, I still say I didn't see any evidence of any high, what we would consider to be high technology.
So, John, I've noticed that there's a 3D quality to the CymaScope images that you've taken. Can you give us a little bit of an explanation or elaborate on that?
Sure, yes. After the Great Pyramid experiments, I developed a very early version of the CymaScope instrument using a membrane such as we'd used in the Great Pyramid, which was PVC. But in the very first CymaScope instrument, I used latex, a very thin form of latex, on which I sprinkled sand as the revealing medium. But very quickly realized, for about a year we did that, and very quickly realized that there was not a lot of detail that you could obtain from a sand-based image or a particulate matter-based image. And so I began to experiment with water as the revealing medium. And straight away, we got amazing results with the water. Water has a very fast transient response, its ability to follow a sound very quickly. But more importantly, it has the potential to create huge amount of detail in a sound image that we now call cymaglyphs. So cymaglyphs is the word for a sound image that we use. And but one of the qualities of water, of course, is that it's transparent, right? And one of the things that we discovered with water is that when a sound is injected into water, first of all, you get this beautiful pattern that will appear, a surface standing wave pattern that would be called on the surface of the water. But what about the depth of the water? It's not just the surface of water, is it? There's depth to water. And so was the sound actually structuring the molecules of the water beneath the surface of the water? The answer is yes. And so when you look at any of the, well, not any, but almost all of the cymaglyph images that we have on our website, you will see a certain amount of depth in the image. And that depth, it turns out, is real. Initially, when we first saw this depth phenomenon, what looked like depth in a 2D image, we weren't really sure. Is this really structure beneath the surface, or is there some, trick of the light or whatever? But then we did a series of experiments that showed that sound really does structure water in the depth of the water. So in other words, if you think about it, Joe, in terms of like a lens that you would have on a camera, say, that shapes light, as it passes through that lens. Well, water, if you think of water being structured by sound, what it does, the sound compresses molecules of water together in certain areas and allows them to, just expand in other areas. And so you have different densities of water, in other words, caused by the sound, created by the sound. And so what this does is it literally causes light to reflect back towards the camera when we're, trying to take an image of a given sound pattern. And so you're seeing detail not only from the surface of the water, but also from the depth of the water. Well, the implications for this are amazing, because if you think about it, this, again, coming back to sound healing, how sound, creates some kind of a trigger response in a human body. Well, now we realize that the sounds all around us, the environment, or if you're listening to music or whatever, all those sounds are obviously passing through your body, particularly the low frequency sounds. But they're not just passing through, are they? What they're doing is they're actually providing structure within the fluid in your body, within the water content of your body. That it's literally structuring your body. And so that could have huge implications ultimately for medical science.
Right.
And it's very early days, for this, but certainly it's a very important discovery to have made, that sound creates structure not just on the surface but also in the subsurface.
Right. Now, have there been any frequencies in particular that have been discovered to, I guess we can use the word loosely, rectify certain organs back into health by attuning them to certain frequencies? Meaning, like, does the lung have a certain frequency? Does the heart have a certain frequency? Does that make sense?
It makes sense, yeah. Well, I think the first thing to say is that there's been very little scientific work done on sound healing, and because it hasn't been taken seriously by the medical world. Ultrasound as a healing modality is taken seriously, has been taken seriously for many years. In the 1950s, ultrasound, high frequency sounds, these are sounds generally in hospitals, they're used generally in the range 1 million hertz to 2 million hertz. So that is sound that is obviously even way above what a dolphin, can create. But nevertheless, these are very high frequency sounds used every day, commonly in hospitals, in sports injury clinics. They can be used for therapeutic applications, such as a broken bone. Let's say you have a broken bone that has been disturbed, in a normal state of healing. So you had a broken bone, they've put a cast on your arm or whatever, or your leg, and then you've done something really silly. Like you've lifted something that you shouldn't have done or whatever, and that has disturbed the fracture. What happens very often when a fracture is disturbed like that, the body, for whatever reason, will not continue the healing process. It kind of shuts down the healing process, and that fracture will not heal. Well, if you go to a hospital with that problem, they will give you ultrasound on the fracture, on the fracture area, and that will kickstart the healing process again. Or if you have a very severe soft injury tissue, again, they will give you ultrasound to help to speed up the process of healing of your soft tissues. But the amazing thing is about that is that no one in that world, in the medical world, could tell you how ultrasound actually does that. What is the mechanism?
That was going to be my next question to you. How does it actually do that? And then you answered it. Okay.
What's the underpinning mechanism?
Right.
A lot of literature on it, and there's a lot of hypotheses, concerning it, but nobody actually knows how it does what it does. And it doesn't seem to matter, in medical world, if something works, don't knock it. If it works, it works. You don't have to know exactly how it works, as long as it has no side effects. Well, actually, with ultrasound, there are definite side effects if the ultrasound is not applied in a normal way. You're supposed to keep the applicator moving. This is the sound head, and you would move it around the site of the injury slowly, keeping it moving the whole time. If you don't do that, then you get a heating effect in the tissues, and you end up with burns, internal burns. So you can have very bad side effects with ultrasound, but providing it's administered correctly, it has huge benefits, for humanity.
Right.
But getting back to your question, basically about audible sound as a therapy, there's been virtually nothing done on that from a scientific viewpoint. Probably because the amount of money that it would take to conduct a study, no one is prepared to put that money in. You can't see the pharmaceuticals wanting to do that, can you? They're not going to invest millions in something that isn't a drug.
Right.
So who's going to do it? And when you think of the amount of studies that would have to be conducted, it costs millions and millions of dollars to do these kind of studies, to ensure that whatever the therapy is, in this case sound therapy, doesn't have any side effects and so on. It's a hugely expensive thing. So there's very little work being done. But some work has been done, and the work that Cymatics that I mentioned earlier, the sound of cells, that work is a great step forward, and certainly it's helped me with my work, my hypotheses into how sound heals. And other work has been done just in terms of the resonance of body parts. That's something that's been done that was done a long time ago. So you get the situation, for example, where a whole human being resonates at approximately 7 hertz, depending on the weight of the human being. It might be, 5 hertz to 10 hertz, but in that range, an average person, the whole human being resonates at about 7 hertz. A heart, about 100 hertz, somewhere in that ballpark.
And who did this research? Is there a reference link to this research?
I could probably provide you with, we've got we've got a nice little library here in the laboratory with a lot of reference books. I could probably provide you with a link to that kind of work. And we've got a great graphic that we could also provide you with that shows these resonance principles.
Okay.
Where a whole person is around about 7 hertz, a heart in the area of 100 hertz, and then cells, individual cells, most of them resonate in the area of about 1,000 hertz. And the nice thing about all this is, of course, that all these frequencies are well within, normal human capabilities. We can produce those frequencies readily. The 7 hertz, of course, is very, very, very low frequency, but in any case, anything between 100 and 1,000 is what you would listen to in your music every day. I mean, that's just regular daily frequencies.
It's amazing stuff. Now, on that note, is it possible to basically to dissolve, let's say, matter, because it's kind of on the same thing? If every single body part and every single structure has a certain type of frequency, is it possible, in theory, to dissolve matter or construct matter alone by sound frequency?
Are we talking about biological matter here?
Well, let's just say like a rock, for example, or a solid object, some kind of an inanimate solid object. Would it be possible to dissolve it, or even in theory construct it using sound vibrations alone?
Yes, I think is the general answer. You can. I think the lithotripsy, of lithotripsy, which is used in hospitals, for example. I know we're getting back to medical science here, but to answer the question, for example, in hospitals they use lithotripsy, which is very high sound pressure shock waves to destroy kidney stones, for example, in your body. They break them up simply through high pressure sound. And so, if you stage that up to, some kind of a huge machine, a weapon, probably it would be classified as, you can imagine a beam of sound coming out of that weapon that would break up anything, basically, if it's got enough power behind that beam. Yes, you can use sound in a destructive way. but equally you can use sound in a constructive way,
Sure.
of course. And again, coming back uh, to to Jim Zesky's work, the whole idea of listening in to the song of a cell. Well, what if we're talking about a cell that's not a healthy cell? Let's say you're listening to the sound of a tumor cell. Well, a tumor cell has a different song to a normal healthy cell. So if you listen into the sound of a tumor and it has this particular set of frequencies, if you were to then amplify the song of that tumor cell thousands of times to a level at which you would then inject back into the tumor via some kind of a probe device, then what would happen? What would happen is that the tumor, through the simple laws of resonance, would absorb that sound, because it's its own song, right? It's all the frequencies within its own song. You're then sending them back into the tumor. What would happen is the tumor would melt away simply because it's absorbing too much of that energy, and the cells would begin to implode and would be literally destroyed as a result of this simple laws of resonance. Well, that's one of the things that, one of the potentialities from Jim Zesky's work ultimately could be a way of eradicating tumors. You couldn't eradicate them quickly. You'd have to do it over a period of time, because obviously there would be huge toxicity in the body through all this tumor debris floating around. You'd have to do it over a period of days, I guess, depending on the size of the tumor. But then looking at the constructive aspect of sound, you can see in the CymaScope imagery, for example, that you get these absolutely gorgeous patterns forming from music or, any other beautiful sound. If you have harmony in the sound, you'll have harmony in the picture. In fact, we have this saying in the CymaScope team: beauty in equals beauty out. If you put a beautiful sound into the CymaScope, you will always get a beautiful image. Well, if you think in terms of, instead of putting that sound into water, let's say we put it into acrylic resin. And now we're going to structure the acrylic resin with the sound. And as we keep that frequency going into the acrylic resin, eventually the resin, through the chemical reactions in the resin starts to solidify. And what do we have? We have sound made visible in a solid form. In other words, we've kind of created a beautiful pattern of sound in the solid form. But I guess you're probably meaning something a bit more.
Well, no, that actually does answer the question, but I was also referring to if you can, out of potentially, not that there's nothing, but if you could use just sound waves, and through some kind of a medium, which wouldn't necessarily not be apparent to our eyes, construct matter out of apparently nothing, kind of like nanotechnology, I guess.
Oh, I see. Well, you can't construct nothing out of nothing. You can't construct something out of nothing, rather. You've got to have a medium to begin with.
Right.
If you have a medium, whether it's a gas or a solid, you can certainly modify the shape or the structures within that gas or within a solid or a gel. You can modify them significantly by sound into whatever form you want, basically. Yeah, it can be used either destructively or constructively.
Now, what about in your personal line of research? What is kind of your holy grail that you hope to achieve or discover in this line of research?
Well, probably lots of them, actually. But
well, if there was one, or several of them.
If there was one, I think it would be the gift of knowing exactly how sound heals, because that event that happened for me in the Great Pyramid almost 20 years ago, it really did change my life, and I know for sure it would change the lives of millions of people worldwide if we could heal disease without pharmaceuticals, without drugs, in other words, and simply using energy medicine, a form of energy medicine, which I believe would be based on sound. And if I could discover that would be my holy grail, because what a great gift to humanity, to be able to create a healing system that didn't use drugs. I mean, that would be something special.
Phenomenal, absolutely, and it's kind of almost like on that free energy concept, where you're kind of taking something and really resonating it towards something as simple as healing, which would be a tremendous boon, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
So the Cymoscope rather app that you guys developed, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this is an exciting concept for us because it started about 3 years ago when we realized that the Cymoscope itself is a wonderful tool, but it's a very expensive tool. It's a bit like buying an expensive laboratory microscope or something. It would cost you a lot of money, a lot of dollars. The Cymoscope's a similar kind of thing. It's a scientific instrument. We are looking at developing a much lower cost Cymoscope that would be more like a kind of semi-professional Cymoscope, and it would cost a lot less. But even so, it's still going to have quite a big dollars price tag on it. So we thought about, why don't we create a Cymoscope app? And so we started working on that about 3 years ago. And last year, we finally got to the stage of launching the Apple version. It's for iPad and iPhone initially, it was a year ago. And in that year, it's done extremely well. So many thousands of people around the world have written to us, congratulating us on the Cymoscope app. And now we're just on the cusp now of launching the Android version. It's matter of fact, it is already now in the Google Play Store.
Nice.
And so it's only just become available, although we haven't really officially launched it yet. But I have it. I have the Apple version here. This is a short demonstration of just some of the great features of the Cymoscope app for Apple iPad, iPhone and a whole range of Android-powered devices. The circular keyboard represents the first 40 notes of a concert grand piano, and the attack, plateau and decay phases can be seen for each note. I'll tap out a jingle so you can see what I mean. The imagery you're seeing is not a computer simulation or an old-fashioned sonic visualizer. These dynamic patterns are literally sound made visible on a laboratory Cymoscope and stored in the app's memory for you to learn from and enjoy. Two of the app's other great features are the tuning function and the record function. At the bottom right-hand corner here, you'll see it's set on 440 currently. If I tap that, you'll see two other options, 432 and 444. Let's select 444 and press done. Now you'll see that the imagery is no longer colorized, but in fact is monochrome. But the other thing you'll notice is that the patterning is completely different to 440, and also if you check on 432 you'll see a completely different set of patterns again. Now let's check out the record function. If I press record and play that same melody, and now hit record button again and then the play button, you'll see that it replays that melody precisely, not only in terms of the notes that I chose, but also the timing intervals between the notes, and you can record a sequence of up to 144 notes in the record feature. Now let's switch the app to microphone activation mode by tapping the microphone icon at the top left-hand corner. Now we can sing to the device or play a musical instrument, and the imagery that emerges is based on the fundamental frequency of your voice or musical instrument. It's so sensitive it can even pick up my voice frequencies, as you can see. This is a great feature for house parties, and if you're a teacher of children, any of the patterns can be captured by pressing the camera icon button. You can see then that you can share on Facebook, send to someone or save to the photo library so that you can print out a hard copy. Now let's return to the home screen by pressing cancel and then the microphone button again, and we return to the home screen. So there are just a few of the app's many great features. And remember, you can mirror your smartphone or tablet to a desktop computer or video projector. The Cymoscope app is a great way of having fun with cymatics.